Okay, scholars, today I'm going to be lecturing on social media and mass media. I previously recorded a video for this and uploaded it for most of your classes, but unfortunately there was no sound, and silent movies don't work very well when you're trying to lecture online. So I need to obviously create a new video for you guys for Chapter 6. So let's get into it. Today we're going to talk about, as I said, mass media and social media. And so we'll start out with a discussion of the sociological perspectives. And so, of course, as you might imagine, the functionalists are going to talk about what the media, and here we're talking about not just print media, but also so that would include print media, of course, would include newspapers and magazines and things of that nature, but other forms of communication to the masses, such as using radio or television. And then, of course, today we have electronic means of communicating through our smartphones, the internet, computers, and things of that nature. And the apps that we use, Facebook and Twitter and all of those kinds of social media apps are now also a part of the way that we share information with large numbers of people. And so that's kind of a basic definition of mass media and social media. It's both print and electronic means of communicating. And of course, social media is a little bit different in that the information that we're getting is not always coming from verified sources. And anybody can tweet anything that they want to put out there and retweet newspaper articles and things of that nature that might not come from legitimate sources. But right now we want to focus on how the media can help society or benefit society in a variety of ways, because we want to look at it from the functionalist perspective. And so the functionalist will focus on the various benefits to society that mass media and social media can provide. And of course, if you think about that just a little bit, you know that, for example, informing people, sharing information, sharing news. There was a time when it could take weeks or even months for news to make it across the country. If we think about the pre-telegraph days with the Pony Express and people writing letters, it could take a very long time. Once newspapers arrived on the scene, people would share newspapers, and sometimes it would take several days or weeks, or in some cases even months, for a newspaper to make it from the East Coast to the West Coast. Today, of course, media is much quicker. We're able to share information much more quickly, and of course electronic means have contributed to that, but also having a U.S. Postal Service that can carry a letter from one side of the country to the other side of the country in a matter of 3 or 4 days at the most, if we're talking about first class mail, prior to the changes that are going on with the U.S. Postal Service recently that seem to be delaying the delivery of mail. And so today we can share information through a variety of avenues and much more quickly than in the past, but informing us is one of the major functions of the media. Of course, the media can also entertain us. We watch programs on television, or if we have moved away from that and we use streaming services, we can watch various news programs and documentaries and exposés, as well as fictional accounts. We can watch Breaking Bad or The Big Bang Theory or those kinds of things for entertainment purposes. If we're sports fans, of course, we can watch our favorite college team or our favorite NFL team or our favorite baseball team. If we're a baseball fan, we can watch the Dodgers and the Tampa Rays play in the World Series, and that's entertainment, right? Well, those are two functions, but there are other functions that mass media and social media can provide. And so one might be that it can elevate certain issues or certain people in our public eyes. It can give a status. So, for example, keeping up with the Kardashians has made the Kardashian family household words. household names. And so the Black Lives Matter movement has certainly been elevated by the videos that have been shot showing police officers using questionable, in some cases downright inappropriate force against people of color. And so, again, social movements can actually gain status within our society by using mass media and social media in an effective manner. Okay, so we know that mass media and social media can inform us, it can entertain us, it can provide status to either an individual or a group or a movement. It can also encourage us to buy products. Ads on television, and now, of course, today we see if you watch a YouTube video and it's more than 5 or 10 minutes long, there's a good likelihood that you'll see ads not only at the beginning of the video, but then interspersed throughout the video. And those ads are trying to get us to buy certain goods or products or services, right? And so marketing is another function of the media. And we could also use the media to kind of enforce our social norms on people. So, for example, when we watch a police show, a drama where these guys commit crimes, and by guys, I don't mean to be sexist, men and women may be involved in criminal enterprises, and we watch this show and the police investigate the crimes and they eventually make some arrests, and the group that's responsible ends up in court and they are tried and convicted and sentenced to prison. That helps to reinforce that, hey, if you do these kinds of things, you are going to run afoul of law enforcement officers and there will be a punishment for it. So it can reinforce our rules in society. And so enforcing social norms is an important function of the mass media and to some extent social media. When people post videos of someone being sentenced for committing a crime, a heinous crime, that helps to reinforce our social norms. And then I mentioned marketing. Functionalists would talk about that as being a way to promote consumption. I didn't know I needed a 4K TV until I started seeing print stories about the sharpness of a 4K television when using a 4K source. And so when we see a car that has lane assist or other safety features, we don't realize we need that car. We don't really need it. We don't realize we want that car, but the media can be used to create needs. I saw that. It's really cool. Now I feel like I need that product. And so those are the 5 major functions of mass media: to entertain us, to inform us, to help socialize us. I didn't really mention that, but kids learn a lot about the world around them by the television programs they watch. So we encourage kids to watch things like Sesame Street and SpongeBob and some of those programs that we hope have a positive social message. And so our kids learn to count and learn to designate different sounds to different letters, and which helps them learn to read. And so socialization is also an important function. Entertaining and informing, socializing us, conferring status, promoting consumption, and things of that nature, enforcing our social norms. Those are some of the major functions of the media. But functionalists also point out that sometimes we can be so bombarded with messages about something that we can start to tune them out. And they call that the narcotizing desensitization effect. And so if we are constantly bombarded with these very negative messages about, for example, a war in another country that we're involved in, people may start to tune it out at some point and stop paying attention to the message. If we're constantly bombarded with commercials about starving animals or children in other countries who are starving, we may kind of get hardened to that. And so that can certainly be a dysfunction of social and mass media. If we are so bombarded with negative images that we start to tune it out, that can be a problem. Okay? And so we've talked about most of the major functions of the media. I want to bring your attention to table 6-1 in your textbook. You see there that they've got some data on which celebrities are being the subject of Google searches. And so in 2010, they show that Justin Bieber, Katy Perry, Selena Gomez, and Kim Kardashian were the top four Google searches in this country. And then we look at 2013, we see that the names have changed a little bit. Nelson Mandela, Paul Walker, James Gandolfini, Aaron Hernandez, Adrian Peterson. These are some of the names that showed up in the top 10, and they're showing up there because there are events going on, and they're part of some things that are happening. So, for example, Adrian Peterson, I believe, was accused of child abuse because he spanked his son. And people felt that his behavior was inappropriate. I think perhaps he was a little too physical with his son. And so there's this whole discussion about corporal punishment, and should schools use corporal punishment? Should parents use corporal punishment? And if they do use corporal punishment, what's an acceptable level of punishment? And in this case, Adrian Peterson was accused of using excessive force against his son. Then in 2017, we see Michael Flynnmore, Melania Trump, Kevin Spacey, Harvey Weinstein, and we know why Kevin Spacey and Harvey Weinstein are there. The Me Too movement took off in 2017, and of course those people were very much in the news at that time, right? Matt Lauer, Meghan Markle, these are some of the names that were in the top 10 of Google searches in 2017. And if we did those searches today, we would probably see Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, Donald Trump, perhaps Don Jr. and Eric and Ivanka, and some of those names would likely be in there because they're very much in the news today, right? And so I've talked a little bit about promoting consumption, marketing, and all of that. The way that television programs are paid for is through the ads that are sold during those programs, and those ads help to fund the salaries of the actors and actresses, the writers, and the grips and the best boys and all those individuals who are involved in producing a program. Their salaries are paid for by the ads that are sold during that program. And so advertising does serve a very important function. But functionalists will admit that this can lead to what we call hyper-consumerism. I was kind of alluding to that a few minutes ago when we start thinking that, I have to have this product, I have to have this product. Do you really? You ask yourself the question, think of the thing that you want most right now, the material object that you would most love to have right now, and ask yourself, is that a necessity? Is that a need, or is that a want? And most of the time it's going to be a want that we have come to re-envision as a need, okay? It is absolutely impossible to escape the advertising and the messages that we're getting. You can minimize it by, changing channels, flipping channels when commercials come on. You can, stream more programs, and that may allow you to avoid some of the ads that you've been seeing on cable television and things of that nature. But, even on the internet, we know that the advertisers are going to find us, right? So I did say that advertising does perform some functions and brings with it some dysfunctions as well. As I said, it does encourage us to support the media that's being produced. It also supports the economy. When people are going out and spending their money and buying various products, that stimulates the economy, that ensures that the various factories in the United States, although those are beginning to decline in number, right? The factories have orders, and so they can pay their employees to go in and work in the factory. Today, we know that a lot of factories have been moved overseas, but we still have distribution centers and we have retail outlets where those products are sold once they're imported from, in many cases, China and other countries where the labor costs are significantly cheaper than they are here in the U.S. As I said, it underwrites the cost of media when those ads are being played on the Super Bowl. That helps to pay for the enormous cost of the television rights for the Super Bowl, right? And then it can contribute to, as I said, a culture where we start to see needs or wants, desires as actual needs, and that can sometimes that can be a problem because we become dissatisfied with our lives because we think everybody else has all these wonderful, great things and we can't afford them. That can lead to some dissatisfaction, right? So I've talked a little bit about the narcotizing desensitization, and we said that that happens when people are just kind of become overwhelmed with all the negative images, and they start to shut things out a little bit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the conflict perspective and how they view mass media. They are going to focus less on how media can benefit society, and they're going to focus on how the media might be used to manipulate people in society. And so they're going to talk about, this whole American dream that we saw played out in television programs like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best and the Brady Bunch and all of these kinds of programs that present a certain image of what American life is like. The reality is that life is not like that for most people in America, but it definitely creates that perception that if you want to be successful in the United States, you have to go to school and get a good education, and you have to go to into the economy and work in a job, work really hard, work long hours, be very innovative, and eventually you're going to be successful. Okay, that's kind of this idea that we have of the American dream, and there's a lot of truth to it. Certainly, it is important to get an education and develop job skills that are more marketable and that will allow you to move into industries that have good paying jobs. If you didn't believe that, and if I didn't believe that, we wouldn't be having these classes, and we wouldn't be working to get skills. And here in sociology, we teach critical thinking skills, and we teach a number of skills that can be useful. Most people who major in sociology don't consider themselves to be sociologists unless they go on and get a master's or a PhD. But they may go to law school, they may work in advertising. There are a lot of different career fields. They may work in business because having a degree in sociology makes you well prepared for a variety of economic opportunities that don't necessarily involve people who call themselves sociologists. Okay, so we all believe that that American dream is real. That if you work hard and you do well in school and you get an education and then you apply the skills that you developed in school to the workplace, that you will be successful and get a good job and move up the corporate ladder and experience some upward social mobility. But Marx and other conflict theorists believe that that view of the American dream has really been distorted, and we have used this idea that all you have to do to be successful is work hard and you're going to achieve upward social mobility. We've used that to convince people that those who are not successful economically are unsuccessful because they just didn't work hard enough, and it's their fault. It's due to their lack of effort or their lack of skill that has resulted in them experiencing perhaps no mobility or in some cases downward mobility. Okay, so what conflict theorists will point out is that the media can focus on this group gets this and that group's disadvantaged, and it can exacerbate the divisions that exist in society. Gender, race, ethnicity, and social class are all divisions that can get kind of parceled out. And if we, so I think conflict theorists would point out that if we're all focused on what other people are getting and what our group is not getting, that can lead to greater divisions within society, and it can lead to hostility and anger, and in some cases violence against other groups. The media decides what to transmit, and so if the images that we have of poor people is that it's mostly occurring in inner city areas, in ghettos and slums, and it disproportionately involves people of color, then we may assume that, well, the majority of people who are receiving government benefits, for example, are minorities. And the reality is that that is not true. The data shows that whites, about 44% of those who are receiving government assistance are white. So if you look at the other groups that are receiving it, it's really roughly about equal, minority groups versus the majority group. And if we look further into this, we will see that a lot of the people who are receiving government assistance are in rural areas rather than in urban slums. So we get something of a distorted view of who welfare recipients are. And if we're focusing all of our attention on people who are receiving welfare, we tend to ignore those who are at the top of the structure, like, fossil fuel companies, oil companies, energy companies who are getting government subsidies in the millions of dollars on an annual basis. And that may certainly be more money than we're paying out in a lot of the social welfare programs, but we don't call corporate entities who are getting government tax breaks and subsidies and things of that nature, we don't call them welfare cheats, right? And so the conflict perspective would point out that wealthy people are in control of the media, and they have a lot of influence over what stories get published in the newspaper or get put on Fox News or Rachel Maddow. And so they're going to point out that wealthy people control a lot of the information that's out there. Plus, they also control a lot of the stories that get told. I remember how excited I was when The Cosby Show came on, and Bill Cosby, who played in that particular show, he played an OBGYN whose wife was an attorney. And so they were very well off. They were upper middle class and doing very well, and they had children who were college bound. It presented a very different view of black families in America than we had seen prior to that. If you look at the programs that showed African American families prior to the Cosby Show, they presented a radically different view of black families. And so I'm not going to say that those views were entirely inaccurate, but they certainly were incomplete. They didn't show the whole story. There certainly are African American middle class families, but we weren't seeing those being depicted in the television programs. We would see Good Times and Sanford and Son and some of those programs about very poor African American families, but the Cosby Show was really transformative in that way. Okay, but that if you think about the number of people of color who were being presented in television programs and movies in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the last 15, 20 years, we see that the focus was on white families largely, and when we did see people of color in the mass media, a lot of times they were in very stereotypical roles. You would see a black man as a janitor or a sanitation worker. You'd see a Hispanic male as a busboy or things of that nature. And I think one of the things that I'm really excited about in regards to the streaming services is that a lot of stories are getting told today that 20 years ago just would not have been on television. And so I have some hope in the promise of the streaming services and new forms of media that will tell stories that historically just weren't being told. Okay. Now, conflict theorists will say that there's a lot of gatekeeping. I was talking about wealthy people being in control of what gets on television and in the movies, and gatekeeping is the term that we use for that. Gatekeeping is defined as how material must travel through a series of gates or checkpoints before it finally reaches the public. And so various stories, various fictional stories, but also documentaries and stories about political corruption and things of that nature may not be publicized and widely spread because wealthy people don't want those stories to get out there. Okay. I generally believe that most reporters want to do a great job reporting, and yes, they certainly want to get the scoop and beat other reporters to it. But they want their stories to be accurate because not only do they lose credibility as reporters, but reporting in general loses credibility when people use unsubstantiated sources and things of that nature. But even when people are trying to, tell the truth as it is, as they see it, there's the kicker, right? As they see it, they might slant stories in one direction or another. So it's very important when you're watching a news story or anything that's purporting to tell you information about a political candidate or a political party or a social movement or whatever, that you check the source and see who it is and see if they are biased or unbiased. Now, just because they may have some biases doesn't mean that every story they run is going to be inaccurate. But if you know, for example, that Rachel Maddow is a very left-leaning person, you want to watch the stories that she talks about and ask yourself, where is she getting her information? We know that she has a particular perspective that she's coming from. Just as when you watch Fox News, a story on Fox News, you need to be aware that they also have a perspective that they are seeing things from, and they are presenting things from through that lens. So we just need to ask ourselves the question: who is the source of this information? What is their data source? And do they have a particular perspective that influences the way they present those stories? So in a lot of countries, we know that the government has a vested interest in presenting certain information. For example, if you're in Cuba, you're probably going to hear a lot of pro-communist programs and things of that nature on the radio and on television. They are probably going to present a pretty negative perspective on capitalism and the United States being kind of the symbol of capitalism in the world. So we just need to be aware of the biases that people have and what's influencing their decision. And if something's coming from the government, certainly they have their own agenda when they share that information with us. I tend to believe that the United States does a better job than a lot of other countries in vetting sources and things of that nature and making sure that stories are accurate. But, the last 4 years have really changed the way that we consume information because we have a president who constantly uses the term fake news and, accuses the mainstream media of being biased against him. And in some cases there may be some bias, but in some cases that bias may have been earned through being called, a fake news source. So, we just need to be very careful about how we consume news because we do have to ask the question, what is this person's perspective and what agenda might they have when we consume that? And be aware that gatekeeping does occur, that there are entities that don't want us to have certain forms of information and things of that nature. Now, gatekeeping doesn't occur quite as much on the internet. People can send messages via social media, web pages and blogs and things of that nature, and there's less censoring. Although there have been calls on Facebook and Twitter and other entities to kind of clamp down on stories that are clearly falsehoods. And so the question is, do we allow that stuff to be propagated through the internet, or do we censor that stuff because we know that people are making outrageous claims that just aren't true? There are some restrictions on the internet. For example, in the past, we've had some laws regarding gambling online, internet pornography, and political discussions and things of that nature. But compared to television and other media, the internet has fewer restrictions. Okay, the internet can kick people out of various apps or sites, websites, and things of that nature if they engage in offensive behavior. And so we've seen that. And then, of course, as I said, other countries can restrict access to their own citizens. China is very restrictive in what their citizens are able to see through the internet and through other forms of media. So another thing that occurs that conflict theorists are concerned about is what is called media monitoring. And there are lots of different types of media monitoring. In some cases, we're talking about internet. We're talking about groups that want to kind of police the internet or police television. Family groups that want wholesome programming on the television or on streaming services might try to exert their influence and make sure that kids are not being exposed to negative messages. So that's one form of media monitoring. And so, focus on the family and groups like that may, watch various programs that they think are questionable, and they may complain to the FCC to try to get something done about those programs. Parents also engage in media monitoring, right? If you're the parent of a teenager or even a younger child, you know that there are a lot of things on the internet that you don't necessarily want your kids being exposed to. And so people can install various filters on their computers and try to prevent kids getting access to violent or racist messages or pornographic images and things of that nature. I tell the story that when I was 12 years old, about the only thing our parents had to really worry about with regards to their young sons is that somebody might steal a Playboy or a Penthouse from their dad's collection and bring it out and share it with his friends. Today, if you think about what's available to kids at 12, 13 years of age, they can get on the internet, and there's some really, really scary and harmful images and portrayals of relationships and sexual relationships on the internet, and that's pretty frightening stuff for parents. I have a daughter who is now 18 years old, so she's an adult now. I don't really have the concerns that I've had in the past, but you always want to try to protect your kids from those kinds of messages because much of the pornography that you see on the internet, according to research, is abusive and harmful, particularly to young women. And so those kinds of images are very damaging. And so a lot of us, even though, we're not saying that somebody watches that and they go out and start raping people or things like that. I just don't want my daughter to get her idea of what healthy relationships are like from some of the images that are out there on the internet. So, just be aware that, that certainly is one of the risks that comes with having children, is that they might be exposed to messages that you find offensive and inappropriate. Okay, so parents engage in some media monitoring, and at some point, when the kids reach 15, 16 years of age, that media monitoring begins to decline a little bit. So when kids are 13 and 14, there seems to be a little more caution used with the parents, a little more effort to kind of have an idea of what those kids are watching. Okay. Conflict theorists are also concerned about this dominant ideology, and I was kind of alluding to that a little bit ago. The dominant ideology is defined as a set of cultural beliefs and practices that helps to maintain powerful social, economic, and political interests. So if we want to assume that poor people are poor because of their own lack of effort or their own lack of skills, rather than there's something wrong with the structure of society and the opportunities that people have, we can present images that show poor people in a very negative light while extolling the virtues of those who go to college and start their own company and rise up through the ranks. And certainly those things do happen, but conflict theorists are going to point out that we focus so much on that we come to assume that anybody who's not successful must be unsuccessful because of their own efforts and not because society is unequal, that there's, something called white privilege and middle class privilege, and that the lower classes may struggle to get good economic and educational opportunities, and that there may be some discrimination that has impacted their lives as well. So the media can transmit messages that essentially defines what we regard as the real world. And if we look at the people who are making decisions about what gets on television or in the movies or in these various other forms of media, those folks are overwhelmingly white, male, and wealthy. And so the images are images that they're comfortable with. Most of them don't want to present images that are uncomfortable, that make them feel uncomfortable. And the stories of the lives of people of color may make them feel uncomfortable in some cases. Okay, the lives and ambitions of subordinate groups tend to be ignored as a result of that. And so that dominant ideology of blaming the victim and presenting stories that we're comfortable with, it results in people being underrepresented in the media. So in terms of constructing reality, I've kind of alluded to this earlier when I talked about if the images that we see of poor people are people of color in inner city areas, that forms the basis of how we view poverty and the poor. And it can lead to some stereotyping. And we know that stereotypes are unreliable generalizations about a group of people that may be true of some of the members of that group, but it's the stereotype is applied to everyone within the group. So, we don't acknowledge that, there are African American doctors and lawyers and judges and police officers. There are opportunities and some people are having success, but we sometimes brush that aside and make assumptions about people on the basis of their country of origin, their gender, their racial or ethnic composition, and things of that nature. And that's what we mean by stereotyping. If you are only showing African Americans or other people of color in certain roles because, well, it's unrealistic to think that this African American could be a NASA scientist, then you're playing into those stereotypes. You're reaffirming those stereotypes for people that already believe that other groups are less capable than they are. Okay, so we have to look for stories that disconfirm those stereotypes. We have to present the lives of people to show that there's a lot of variation in the lives of whites. And, this assumption that white people are financially better off just for being, having white privilege. There are many, many poor whites in this country, and we need to be aware of that as well, that, skin color doesn't determine how people's lives play out, but it can be a factor, and we need to be aware of that. Okay, today we see more non-heterosexual couples. We see pansexual people who can be attracted to either males or females. We see same-sex couples, and so that's probably a healthy thing because much of the media back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth were really focused on the lives of heterosexuals, and we didn't pay a lot of attention to the lives of those who didn't fit into, this person has a penis, therefore they're masculine, they're male, and they're going to behave in these ways, and this person has a vagina, and therefore they're going to be radically different. There's a great deal more variation. And to look at the world that way is a bit of an oversimplification. So when we start seeing the stories of different people's lives, we realize that, things are not as easy. It's not as clear cut as I once thought. And so there's more variation than I was aware of. And therefore, I need to study more and understand more about everybody's lives, because only then can I really understand what somebody else has experienced. We see that, as an example, 25% of women are considered obese, but on television, only 3% of women are portrayed as obese. So again, that can create this, this thinness model of beauty, where we say, oh my gosh, you have to be as skinny as Courtney Cox, or you have to be really thin. I'm not a big Kardashian fan, but one thing that I can say about the Kardashians is that they've kind of made it okay to be a little more rounded, in terms of physical form, than many of the ideas of beauty prior to them coming onto the scene. So I think today we are beginning to celebrate that women come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and we shouldn't be so judgmental as we have been in the past. And women shouldn't starve themselves and have this horrible negative self-image if they're 10 pounds, 10 pounds heavier than they want to be, or if they're wearing a size 10, they shouldn't feel that they're overly obese. 10 is average. If we look at the women in our society, 10 to 14 is kind of the average dress size. But if you watch Hollywood, you certainly wouldn't get that impression, right? So there's also been a lack of racial and ethnic diversity on television, which I've kind of mentioned already. 45% of the young people in our country today are people of color. And yet, if you watch programs on the lives of American families, you don't see that many people of color. You don't see that many children of color being portrayed in television and film today. And research has revealed severe underrepresentations of Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans on television. And so we need to see more stories about the lives of different people, right? Not just the dominant group anymore. Television can also distort the political process. Today, we get these messages, oh, I'm losing in my race, I need more money. And, sometimes my reaction is, well, if your message is good and it resonates with the voters, why do you need money? Well, I guess you need money to get that message out there, but do you need millions and millions and millions of dollars to get your message out there? I don't think that politics should all be about who can raise the most money, because to me that kind of leads to a lot of corruption. So, but unfortunately, money is important, and the way that people use mass media as politicians is very important in terms of the outcomes of elections. And then when we think about the dominant ideology, we would all agree that, hey, people need to learn about our culture, but we have a very varied culture. The lives of Hispanic people in our country are somewhat different from the lives of other groups. The lives of Japanese Americans who were put in the internment camps in World War II have had a different experience than most of the rest of us. The lives of people who were brought here as slaves from Africa have had a different experience in the United States than some of the other groups who came voluntarily. And so we have to try to figure out, okay, if these television programs are going to focus on the lives of these various groups, whose culture is it that we're going to be exemplifying? And I think it's important that we try to do a better job of showing lots of people of different subcultures and different cultural backgrounds, because only then, as I said earlier, can we start to understand the path that other people have taken. If we only know the experiences that we've had and that our family has had, then we really have kind of a narrow view of what it means to be an American citizen. But by exposing ourselves to other people's stories, we start to find out that, well, gosh, these folks have had some struggles and they've overcome obstacles just to get here, just as my family had to overcome some obstacles. And so we might have taken very different paths, but here we are together today. And can we not figure out a way to forge a future where perhaps people don't have to struggle quite as much to achieve some upward mobility? Okay. So your text talks about what it calls hyperlocal media. And this refers to various websites and things of that nature that focuses on the lives of a very small group of people relative to the whole country. If we've got 330 plus million people, I'll give you an example. I grew up in Sulphur Springs, Texas, a little town of about, I think when I was there, it's probably about 10 or 11,000 people. Today, there's maybe 14 or 15,000 people 30 years later. Hasn't grown a whole lot. But if I want to know what's going on back home, I can go to Front Porch News and look at the Sulphur Springs site on there, and I can read the local newspaper and stories and things of that nature about what's going on in the community in which my parents still live. Okay, so I still have some connections there, still have some family there. But in general, I'm not there very often. I go and visit family, and that's about it. But if I want to get caught up on what's going on, I can use this hyper local media. Go to Front Porch News, look at the Sulphur Springs website, and find out kind of what's going on in my hometown, my former hometown. I'm no longer, I don't consider myself to be a resident. Yes, I grew up there and spent the first 25 years of my life there, but I've been gone longer than I was there. So, I really don't have a strong attachment to that community, other than I still have a few friends and a few family members who live in that area. But it's always going home, right, when you go back to visit. So, what else do I want to talk about? All right. I also want to mention that the conflict theorists will talk about what they call the digital divide. And what they're talking about here is the fact that, sorry, ESPN alert. What they're talking about there is that not everybody has equal access to media. In some countries, televisions are not very prominent. They're not every family has television, or if they do, they don't have the electricity to run the television, and they certainly don't have access to computers and the internet and high-speed broadband internet and things of that nature. Of course, this pandemic that we're currently experiencing has really emphasized the fact that access to cable internet or at least high-speed internet, doesn't have to be cable, but it can, there's other forms of internet access. Those who don't have access to high-speed internet are at a real disadvantage in terms of being able to work from home or being able to study at home and take online courses and things of that nature. So school assignments can be impacted by access to the internet. Medical information, I've got an app on my smartphone. I can go in, if I go to the doctor and I have some blood drawn and they do some tests, I can log in there and see the results of those tests. But people who don't have internet access may have a harder time being able to access that information. I can go to WebMD and look up various symptoms and see if I think I have an illness that requires medical attention or not. And then, of course, as I said, conducting business, being able to work from home, being able to be an entrepreneur and start your own business and have a web presence. If you don't have access to the internet, that's really not a possibility, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about the feminist perspective. We know that the feminist perspective is going to build upon the ideas of the conflict perspective. They're going to look at the inequality that exists, and they're going to point out that women have been portrayed very differently in the media compared to men. Women tend to be underrepresented, first of all, so there are fewer women in media, or at least historically, there have been fewer women stories about the lives of women than there are stories about the lives of men. So women tend to be underrepresented in the media. Now that's getting better. Today, I think there's a great deal more understanding that women are consumers too, and men can be interested in the stories of women's lives. And so we're seeing, I think, a great deal more representation of women's lives today in the media than we did even 15 or 20 years ago. But if you go back to the 1970s, the vast majority of people in the movies were men, at least as central characters, and the women were kind of supporting characters, and they were the cheerleaders. They were the ones that rooted the men on when the men were doing these great and wonderful things, right? The feminist movement would also point out that that most programs perpetuate this stereotypical view of what it means to be male and female. So we see the male going off to do great things in the workplace, or as scientists, or as athletes, or whatever, and we see the little woman staying home and cooking and taking care of the children and those kinds of things. And the feminists are saying that, well, that's really not an accurate representation of what life is and can be for women in our country today. And so women are being portrayed in very stereotypical ways, although I do see some changes there. I do see some real improvement in that area. They would also say that it tends to the media can normalize violence against women. As I said earlier, if you study the roles that men and women play in various television programs, and certainly in like internet pornography and things of that nature, it's not a very uplifting picture for the lives of women. And so it can kind of create this attitude that it's okay to mistreat women, to treat women, hey, this star did it, so it must be okay, right? Of course not. And so feminists would object to programs that tend to normalize violence against women. They would say that, if a male is being abusive to a female character, that there ought to be some repercussions. Perhaps he needs to be shown, being sent to jail or to prison if the offenses are serious enough. But I do believe that feminists are kind of optimistic, cautiously optimistic about the future in regards to the roles that women are being offered and that they're playing. Today we see a lot more females playing superheroes and things of that nature, in the Marvel and various superhero movies and things of that nature. So I think there is reason to be optimistic about the future. We need to continue to push for more stories about the lives of women. So now let me talk just a little bit about the interactionist perspective. And the interactionist perspective, we know, focuses on the interactions that people have within small groups, the way people behave, individuals behave, and how their interactions with each other influence society, but how society also influences those interactions. So here we see that scholars are looking at the media on a micro level to see how they shape day-to-day behavior. And so if we're wanting to know why someone engaged in a particular activity, we might look at the kind of media that they're consuming. For example, let's say that someone bombs an abortion clinic. We might want to go in and look at the computer websites that they visited. We might want to know what kinds of literature they are consuming that shaped their views in such a way that they were willing to carry out horrendous violence against doctors, nurses, and patients who were seeking reproductive services. The interactionist perspective would also talk about social capital. And social capital is defined as the collective benefit of social networks, which are built on reciprocal trust. So today we can have contact with people all over the world. We're not geographically restricted anymore through the use of social media and social apps and things of that nature. And so today New social networks can be formed just by using the internet and looking for people who have similar experiences to your own. And that can be very valuable. If someone is in a community, in a small community, and they think they're the only gay person in the world, that can be pretty daunting. But if they get online and they see that, hey, here's an organization, a local organization, or it doesn't have to be a local organization, but here's an organization that's made up of people very much like you who've had some similar experiences. That can be very gratifying, and it can reinforce your view that, hey, I'm not a freak. I'm not I'm not abnormal. There are other people like me out there. And that certainly can be reaffirming, right? Social networks are also a way to promote consumerism and consumption, as we mentioned earlier. But the internet, according to the interactionist perspective, the internet does bring with it some negatives, right? It's a new way for terrorists and other extremist groups to spread their message and to get people to join their movement. Pornography can certainly be a negative, and the abuse of teenagers and minors can certainly be a problem. And your text also talks about something it calls ego casting, and they define this as the personal management of media exposure to avoid messages that one doesn't like. And so we can work to limit the kinds of access that we have if we know that, for example, Rachel Maddow is a very liberal person and we're conservative. We might avoid her program so that we don't get presented with anything that contradicts our view of the world. There is a tendency among human beings to look for confirming evidence and to ignore disconfirming evidence. So if something is consistent with the way we see the world, we think it's great. If something challenges our view of the world, oh, well, don't bother me with that stuff. I don't want to hear it. It's all fake news anyway. Okay. Of course, information is not evenly distributed throughout our population, and so people are all operating with different levels of understanding and different viewpoints of what the world is like and what it should be like. And of course, the interactionist perspective is going to focus on those variations and those differences, right? So, in talking about marketing, I want you to think about marketing just a moment. Keep in mind that 50 years ago, 60 years ago, marketing was kind of a one-way message. The marketer, the person producing the ad, would tell you what they wanted you to know. Boom, that was the end of the transaction or the consumption of the media. But today, because we've got these social media apps and we've got the internet and everything, it's a two-way street. While I'm presenting a message to you, here's my commercial about my product. If it's online, I can also be collecting. I can use cookies and things of that nature. I can throw in surveys, and I can gather data from you and about you that will help me better market my product. So we need to be aware, and most of you probably already are. If you go on the internet and you do a search for 4K televisions, from now on, at least for a month or two, whenever you see an ad on the web pages, there's going to be oftentimes an ad for a 4K television. I recently did a search for some parts for a boat, and now every time I log on to the computer and see ads pop up, it's usually advertising Wholesale Marine and West Marine and all these various entities that sell boat parts. And so they are collecting information from us using cookies. They are gathering information using online surveys and things of that nature, and they are tracking our movements because if they know what we're looking for and what we're interested in, they can better target those products to us. Now, figure 6.3 has some information about who's using the internet, and I think it's valuable information. So if we look at gender, we see that women use the internet slightly more than men, and that's probably Probably not a big surprise. Although I suspect that these numbers are changing and that men and women are going to be somewhat more equal in the future in terms of how they use the internet. Young people tend to use the internet more than old people. We see that for the 18 to 29 group, it's 88%, and for those who are 65 and above, it's only 37%. In terms of race and ethnicity, not big differences there. White non-Hispanic 68%, black 69%, and Hispanic 72%. So those are probably all pretty close to being within the range of the margin of error. And so there's probably not real differences on the basis of race and ethnicity. In terms of income, people who make more money tend to have a greater likelihood of using the internet. So those who are under 30, only 63%, but those who make over 75,000 a year, we're looking at 77%. In terms of education, more educated people tend to use the internet more than less educated people. And in terms of community, this makes sense. Urban dwellers, people who live in the urban areas or in suburbs, are more likely to use the internet than people who live in the rural areas because it's harder to get high-speed broadband out in rural areas. If you've lived in a rural area or you have friends in a rural area, you know that sometimes getting a good broadband service is nigh on to impossible. Okay. So I just want to make a few comments about the audience, and we'll try to wrap up this chapter. This is probably a little shorter chapter than a lot of the other chapters that we've talked about because this information is fairly straightforward and not quite as complex as perhaps some of the other chapters. But when we think about the audience, we might ask ourselves the question, who is our audience? If you've taken a speech class, you've been told, always know your audience. You want to prepare, if you're giving a speech to first graders, your message is going to be different than if you're giving a speech to high schoolers versus giving a speech to college grads versus people in the business community. So it's important that you know who your audience is. And even if you're just doing a blog or a website or something, you want to know who your consumers are and you want to know as much about them because that allows you to better tailor your message to them. The presence of an audience is necessary. It's that old, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? If you're doing a blog or if you're doing a podcast and nobody's watching it, are you having any impact? Well, of course not, right? Now, our audience can be a well-defined group that we can identify, or it can be a larger group that we don't really know much about, right? Primary groups or secondary groups can both be audiences. If it's a primary group, if we're doing something and we're inviting our family and friends to get in on our podcast, that would be a primary group. But if we're doing something where we're trying to communicate to a larger audience for the purposes of getting something done, getting people motivated perhaps to join an environmental group or a political group, then that's going to be a secondary group rather than a primary group. We studied groups recently, and we kind of know the difference between primary and secondary groups, right? Primary groups tend to be smaller, more based on relationships, and more long-term, more personal. Secondary groups tend to be larger. They're more instrumental in their focus, just trying to get something done. They can be very, very large, and they don't interact with each other for a long period of time. Once the task is accomplished, they move on, they disperse, and they're no longer interacting with each other. Okay. We can also examine an audience from a macro or micro social perspective. Macro, we're looking at what is the group, what are the characteristics of the group? If we're looking at it on a more micro level, what are the individuals like? Let's explore the lives of the individuals within that group. Okay. Today, we're increasingly experiencing what is called a segmented audience. So Rush Limbaugh has been on the radio for many, many years, and Rush Limbaugh is not really talking to me. Okay, he's talking to my dad. His program is more for people who are in that age category and that racial category, and so he knows that he's not going to get me as a listener, but that's okay. He doesn't need me. If he can carve out 1% of the population in a country of 330 million, that's over 3 million listeners. And that's plenty, right? You're going to be, if you can get 3 million people to listen to your program on a daily basis, you're going to have lots of advertisers lining up to advertise on your program. And so today, we're seeing that media is increasingly marketing itself to a particular age category or racial or ethnic group or whatever. And I think there are some benefits to that, because now people may see the lives of people like them being portrayed, but it can also be problematic in some cases. This now leads us to ask the question, is it really mass media anymore if you're targeting to such a segmented part of the population? When we think about the audience, we can have people who are opinion leaders or influencers. This is someone who, through their day-to-day personal contacts and communication, influences the opinions and decisions of others. Mass media and particularly social media has really made this a pertinent part of our lives. Today we have social influencers who espouse certain views and certain products and advocate that we buy certain products that can have an impact on our lives and the way that we behave as members of an audience. As I said, today audiences aren't really as passive as they used to be, because now it's a two-way communication through the internet and social media and things of that nature. And of course, now with the advent of false or fake news stories, that's added another complex little twist to the consumption of mass media. So physical distance is really not an issue anymore. If something happens in Beijing, China tonight that's critically important to us, we will know it within minutes, because the internet and other forms of media today allow us to communicate in ways that we couldn't before. Sorry about that. Some have said that the media have created what we could call a global village, and others believe that global torrent is actually a better term. So if you think about a torrent, for those of you who have ever done any downloading of, and I know none of you have done any of these illegal things, but if you download movies or songs and things of that nature, you can use software called like BitTorrent, BearShare, LimeWire. There's a number of software programs that have in the past allowed people to share various files, including movies and music and things of that nature. Well, when you are pulling pieces of files together from different computers out there that you're connected to via the internet, we call that a torrent. And so some are saying that we really have today what you could consider to be a global torrent, because we're being bombarded with messages from all over the world, all at the same time, and we have to try to make some sense of it. And that can be a little confusing and a little unsettling at times, I think, for a lot of people. So it's not necessarily a global village, it may be a global torrent in that respect. So, countries where internet is not available, your text talks about the fact that there are some countries in Africa, for example, where families are paying $400 a month for dial-up internet. Dial-up internet, for those of you who've not had the experience, is pretty awful. And it's very, very slow. It can take hours and hours to download one program. If you're trying to download, for example, a new browser, you may have to download it overnight if you're using dial-up internet. Now, here in the United States, dial-up internet is almost unheard of today. But in some African countries, that's what they have to try to communicate with each other. So certainly that's a problem. As battery technology gets better, people may be able to use other sources for their televisions and computers and things of that nature. that doesn't rely on having access to an electrical outlet. And so that may help combat some of the problems that we see in countries where people don't even have the basic necessities, what we would consider to be here in the United States, basic necessities of electricity and clean food and water and things of that nature. Television ownership can be viewed as a status symbol in some areas. If you've got a TV, you're ahead of the game in some of these very, very poor countries. Your text kind of finishes up with some discussions about censorship and social policy and how we should present information. I tend to believe that we should present accurate information about as much as we can, and then allow the consumers to make their own decisions about who acted appropriately or inappropriately. But the accuracy is the key there. We have to make sure that our reporters, our news programs are presenting the whole story. And if they're not, then we need to press them to present the whole story, because that's really important if we're going to form opinions about the world around us. Okay. So I think that's a pretty good breakdown of Chapter 6. I told you it would be a little shorter than some of the other chapters that we've had. If you have questions, don't hesitate to email or text me. And so thank you for your attention. An hour and 10 minutes, that's a pretty, or hour and 11 minutes, that's a pretty short video for me. So have a great day. And keep studying hard, read hard, and let's have a successful semester. Bye-bye.